The hidden truth about what Ozempic does to your liver. Something shifted in April 2026 that most people completely missed. A team of researchers at the University of Toronto published findings that quietly dismantled one of the central assumptions driving the entire Ozempic conversation. And what they uncovered wasn't just surprising. It fundamentally changes how we need to think about this drug, who it helps, and who it might be quietly harming. Because here's the thing. Ozempic appears to work directly on the liver through a mechanism nobody expected. And in certain studies, researchers found it could actually begin healing the liver without patients losing a single pound of body weight. But before you get too excited, there's another side to this story. A 67-year-old woman walked into an emergency room just 2 weeks after starting Ozempic. Her ALT level, that's the liver enzyme doctors use to detect damage, came back at 1,616. For context, normal is under 40. Her liver was in active failure from a drug she'd only been on for 14 days. So how do we reconcile those two realities? How can one drug apparently heal the liver in some patients while sending others into acute liver failure within weeks? That's exactly what we're going to unpack today. The two very different faces of Ozempic and what the science actually says about both of them. The miracle side. What the research shows. Let's start with the good news, because it genuinely is remarkable. There's a landmark clinical trial called the Essence Trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Researchers enrolled 800 patients, all of them dealing with a serious condition called metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, which is a clinical way of describing a liver that has accumulated fat, become inflamed, and begun showing signs of scarring. Before the trial began, every single participant received a liver biopsy, not a scan, not blood work, an actual tissue sample. This wasn't a casual study. Over 72 weeks, half the patients received Ozempic. The other half received a placebo. The results were striking. 63% of patients on Ozempic experienced complete resolution of liver inflammation. The placebo group, 34%. Now, I always want to pause here for a second because that placebo number is genuinely fascinating on its own. More than a third of people healed measurable liver inflammation with a sugar pill. The power of belief and participation in a clinical environment is something science still doesn't fully understand. But I digress. On the fibrosis side, that's the scar tissue that forms when a liver has been chronically inflamed. 37% of Ozempic patients showed measurable improvement compared to 22% in the placebo group. Scar tissue reversing. In a major organ, that's not something medicine sees every day. The results were significant enough that in August 2025, the FDA officially approved Wegovy, the same active compound as Ozempic, just higher doses, specifically for treating this advanced form of liver disease. That's a real milestone. But here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The discovery that changed everything for years. The working assumption was simple. Ozempic helps the liver because it causes weight loss. You drop the weight, you reduce the metabolic burden on the liver, inflammation fades, scarring slows. Clean, logical, linear. Except one man wasn't satisfied with that explanation. Daniel Drucker, the researcher who literally co-discovered GLP-1 back in the 1980s, the very hormone that Ozempic mimics, kept noticing something that didn't add up. The liver improvements he was seeing in certain patients were just too fast, too dramatic, too significant to be explained purely by weight loss alone. So, in April 2026, his team published a new study in cell metabolism that turned the field upside down. They engineered mice that were physically incapable of losing weight on Ozempic. Then they gave those mice the drug anyway. Their livers still improved. Inflammation dropped. Fibrosis reversed. Not 1 ounce of weight lost. What Drucker's team discovered was that GLP-1 receptors, the molecular targets that Ozempic activates, aren't just in the gut and the brain. They're hiding in the liver itself. The drug appears to act directly on liver tissue, independent of any weight-related changes. This means the entire scientific community had the mechanism partially wrong. Ozempic doesn't just help the liver as a downstream effect of weight loss. It may be actively communicating with the liver on its own terms. That's a huge deal, and almost nobody is talking about it. The part that should make you stop and think. Here's where I need to slow down, because there's a significant gap between what the science actually shows and how Ozempic is being prescribed and discussed in the real world. The FDA approval for liver disease? It applies specifically to patients with biopsy-confirmed stage 2 or stage 3 liver disease. That's a narrow, carefully defined population, people who've been formally diagnosed through invasive testing and placed under close medical supervision with carefully titrated dosing. 99% of people currently taking Ozempic are taking it for weight loss. That's not a criticism of those people. It's just the reality of the market. And here's why that matters enormously. When someone cites Ozempic is good for the liver, they're almost always referencing that Essence trial data. But that data came from a very specific group of patients at specific dosages under specific monitoring conditions. The liver benefits from that research apply to roughly 1 in 20 people currently taking the drug. Meanwhile, according to current estimates, 38% of all adults have some degree of fatty liver disease, and most of them have absolutely no idea. They feel fine. Their doctors haven't tested for it. There's nothing obviously wrong. And the majority of people starting Ozempic, they're not being closely monitored for liver function. They're often started at a fixed dose right away rather than gradually titrated upward. Their baseline liver health is unknown. The dark side. When Ozempic hurts the liver. Now let's come back to that 67-year-old woman. She started Ozempic for weight loss following bariatric surgery. 2 weeks later, she was in the emergency room with an ALT of 1,616. Let me put that number in perspective. A heavy drinker with cirrhosis might register around 200. A Tylenol overdose victim in active liver failure typically lands somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000. She was sitting right in that range. From 2 weeks on a weight loss drug. This isn't an isolated anecdote. A large-scale analysis covering over 106,000 patients found a measurably elevated risk of acute liver injury in women taking GLP-1 medications compared to those on other diabetes drugs. And yet, hepatotoxicity is not listed on Ozempic's warning label. Liver toxicity is not something doctors are routinely looking for before they prescribe this medication. There's no standard baseline liver panel required, no mandatory follow-up testing. So when patients start experiencing fatigue, mild abdominal discomfort, or a loss of appetite shortly after starting the drug, those symptoms get quietly filed under expected side effects. Nobody connects the dots to the liver until someone ends up in an emergency room. The gallbladder problem. Nobody mentions. There's a second mechanism here that deserves its own spotlight. The gallbladder. Your gallbladder sits directly beneath the liver, connected to it through the bile duct. Under normal circumstances, it contracts rhythmically in response to eating, releasing bile that helps digest fat and clear out cholesterol. Ozempic floods the system with GLP-1 stimulation. Those receptors fire constantly, and the gallbladder, overwhelmed by the signal, essentially stops contracting properly. You now have stagnant bile sitting in a system designed for movement. Bile that isn't moving thickens, becomes sludge, and over time can crystallize into gallstones. This isn't speculation. In 2023, the FDA required Novo Nordisk to add an acute gallbladder disease warning to Ozempic's prescribing label. It's now officially acknowledged, and the cascading effect matters. One of the gallbladder's key jobs is helping the body eliminate excess cholesterol and fat. When that drainage system backs up, it doesn't just affect the gallbladder. It puts additional strain on the liver that's supposed to be processing all of that. Meanwhile, rapid fat loss, which Ozempic does produce in many people, creates its own challenge. When the body begins burning stored fat at an accelerated rate, that fat has to go somewhere. and it flows directly through the liver. A healthy liver with good reserve capacity can handle that fluctuation. A compromised one, and remember, 38% of the adult population has undiagnosed fatty liver, may not be able to. Here's the timing paradox that almost nobody explains. When someone begins losing weight rapidly, the liver often increases in fat content before it starts to come down. The body mobilizes stored fat faster than the liver can process it. In many people, this is temporary and manageable. In others, it tips the balance in the wrong direction. The duration problem. Your biology wasn't built for this. There's one more thing worth understanding clearly. In your body, when you eat a meal, your gut releases natural GLP-1. It does its job, signals fullness, regulates insulin, coordinates digestion, and then it disappears. The whole process takes about 90 seconds. Ozempic's active version of that signal lasts 7 days. That's not a subtle difference. That's the biological equivalent of holding down a car horn for a week straight versus tapping it once. Your liver, your gallbladder, and your gut were not engineered for that level of continuous stimulation. The downstream effects of that constant signal on bile flow, on fat processing, on receptor sensitivity are still being studied. The long-term picture is genuinely unknown. What happens when you stop? There's one more dimension to this conversation that deserves serious attention, because a lot of people assume Ozempic is something you take for a while and then stop once you've reached your goal. Research tells a different story. Studies show that when people stop taking GLP-1 drugs after a year, they regained roughly 2/3 of every pound they lost. Blood sugar improvements reversed. Cardiovascular markers returned to where they started. And when researchers examined body composition, not just scale weight, they found something sobering. Between 25% and 40% of weight lost on these drugs came from lean tissue, muscle, bone, not fat. That matters enormously for long-term metabolic health, for mobility as we age, for how our bodies respond to illness, and for what happens to our metabolism after we stop taking the medication. The root problem that Ozempic doesn't solve. Underneath all of this is something that doesn't get discussed enough in the Ozempic conversation: insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is frequently the foundational issue. When the body's insulin signaling system is dysregulated, weight becomes extremely difficult to lose. The body resists change. There's a metabolic set point that the body defends stubbornly. GLP-1 function becomes impaired as a downstream consequence of that resistance. Ozempic bypasses that problem rather than solving it. It gets people results they couldn't otherwise achieve. Real results, meaningful results. But the underlying dysfunction often remains intact, which is part of why the weight comes back when the drug stops. Insulin resistance can be reversed through lifestyle changes. Advanced liver fibrosis, in many cases, cannot. If you're currently on Ozempic, what actually matters? This isn't an argument to stop your medication. That's between you and your doctor. But there are things worth knowing and advocating for if you're currently on this drug. First, prioritize protein, specifically animal protein. The biggest nutritional threat on Ozempic is muscle loss, because appetite suppression reduces overall intake significantly. If you're eating less, the composition of what you eat matters more. Protein preserves lean tissue. Second, add fermented foods. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and other fermented vegetables have been shown to naturally stimulate GLP-1 production, the very hormone Ozempic mimics. Supporting your body's own production of this hormone is a long-term strategy that works with your biology rather than around it. Third, do resistance training. Not cardio, resistance. Lifting weights, body weight exercises, anything that puts load on your muscles. This is the most powerful tool available for preserving muscle mass during caloric restriction. Fourth, address carbohydrates. This is non-negotiable for fixing the underlying problem. Lowering carbohydrate intake is the most direct lever for reducing insulin levels and over time, reversing insulin resistance. Without addressing this, the drug manages symptoms while the root cause continues. Fifth, and this one is critical if you don't already know your liver status. Ask your doctor for a baseline liver panel, ALT, AST, bilirubin. It's a simple blood draw. Given what we now know about the risk of hepatotoxicity in a meaningful subset of patients, knowing your baseline before or early in treatment isn't excessive caution. It's informed self-care. The bigger picture Ozempic is a genuinely powerful drug. The science supporting its effects on liver disease in the right patient population is real. The discovery that GLP-1 receptors exist directly in the liver tissue is a legitimate scientific breakthrough that will reshape how we think about metabolic medicine. But powerful tools require careful handling. The gap between what the research actually shows, tightly controlled trials, specific populations, careful monitoring, and how this drug is being used at population scale is significant. And in that gap, there are real people developing real complications that aren't being caught because the warning labels are incomplete and the monitoring protocols haven't kept up with the prescribing volume. The liver is forgiving up to a point, but it doesn't announce its distress until things have already gone significantly wrong. Know your baseline. Monitor your liver. Understand that the miracle story and the cautionary story are both true. They just apply to different people, under different conditions, for different reasons, and whichever story turns out to be yours, make sure you find out before it finds you.